just jump right into this explainer because today we're looking at a geographic reality that fundamentally shapes the economic destinies of hundreds of millions of people. And honestly, it directly impacts the price of the goods you and I buy every single day. We're talking about the geographic lottery of being landlocked. Think about it for a second. So much of global wealth, trade, and human history is built entirely on having access to the ocean. So what actually happens when a country is completely shut out from the sea? Well, we're going to explore how physical geography, historical borders, and modern economics all collide to create some wildly unique challenges. And as you'll see, some pretty surprising solutions for landlocked nations. 43. If you were looking at a 3D globe right now and peeled away all the coastal nations, you'd be left with exactly 43 countries completely cut off from the world's open oceans. Now sure, depending on how you classify certain territories, you might occasionally see numbers like 44 or 49 floating around in different data sets, but the core reality remains exactly the same. Roughly 1/5 of all the nations on our planet have absolutely zero direct access to an ocean shore. They are entirely boxed in. So let's define our baseline here real quick. A landlocked country is one that relies entirely on its neighbors for sea access, meaning its borders are 100% land-based. But, geography can be even more unforgiving than that. A double landlocked country is exactly what it sounds like, a nation completely surrounded by other landlocked countries. That means if you want to get goods to or from a seaport, those goods are forced to cross two distinct international borders just to get a whiff of salt water. Part 1. How borders were drawn. So how did these lines actually get drawn on the map in the first place? Well, it mostly comes down to the incredibly messy realities of human history. It wasn't just physical geography trapping these nations. It was wars, empires, and political agreements. First, you had the fall of these vast historical empires that just left smaller, fragmented nations in their wake. Then, jumping to the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial boundaries were arbitrarily drawn up by foreign powers, most notably in Africa, which is actually where 16 of the current 32 landlocked developing countries are located today. And finally, you have modern independence movements. Think about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That abruptly severed a whole bunch of newly independent Central Asian states from the sea overnight. This kind of historical lottery leaves countries literally stranded deep in continental interiors. Take Kazakhstan, for example. Because of the way Soviet borders were drawn up and later finalized when they gained independence, Kazakhstan finds itself a massive 3,750 kilometers away from the nearest open ocean. It's actually the largest landlocked country on Earth, just totally stranded deep in the Eurasian landmass, thousands of kilometers away from the global maritime trade routes that drive our modern economy. Part 2. The high cost of transit. Now, this brilliantly illustrates the core struggle these nations face. For a landlocked developing country, or LLDC, it costs an average of $3,204 to export a single cargo container. Compare that to their coastal transit neighbors, who pay just $1,268 to export the exact same container. That is wild. LLDCs are paying nearly 3 times as much just to get their goods out the door and into the global market. And as you can imagine, those sky-high transport costs just completely erode their competitive edge and actively scare away foreign investors. Because they have to rely entirely on the roads, the railways, and honestly, the political stability of those transit countries, the average trade costs for landlocked economies spike by up to 45% compared to coastal economies. If the neighboring transit country has terrible infrastructure, or if there is sudden political friction between the two governments, the landlocked country suffers all the economic consequences, and they have absolutely no alternative route to fall back on. But the crucial takeaway here is that it's not just about the money, it's about time. Cumbersome customs paperwork, inadequate transit infrastructure, and inevitable border delays actively choke a country's economic growth. The data actually shows that every single additional day a product spends delayed in transit reduces a country's overall trade by 1%. And when you have to cross multiple borders, those days add up incredibly fast. For LLDCs, these delays aren't just occasional inconveniences. They are a baked-in structural barrier to building wealth. Part 3. Depending on the neighbors. Let's look at some fascinating geographic workarounds these nations use to survive and keep trading, because geography is full of loopholes. Take the Caspian Sea, for instance. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan all border it. Now, legally speaking, it's just a massive landlocked lake with no natural outlet to any ocean. But they treat it exactly like a sea. Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan actually maintain active admirals, naval fleets, and major shipping ports right there on an inland lake. It's such a clever workaround, basically building navies for an ocean they don't actually have. Or take Laos, which is the only landlocked country in Southeast Asia. At first glance, it looks like they have the perfect geographic workaround because the mighty Mekong River flows right through the country, pointing straight down to the South China Sea. But nature had other plans. That river route is completely blocked in the south by the Khon Pa-Phang Falls, which is Southeast Asia's largest waterfall by volume. So Laos literally has an ocean access route drawn on the map with a giant impassable waterfall standing right in the middle of it. Then you have countries that have to rely entirely on diplomacy and sheer political cooperation. Way up in the Himalayas, a tiny country like Bhutan, with an average elevation of over 10,000 feet, by the way, has absolutely zero navigable waterways to use. Instead, it has to negotiate complex transit treaties with friendly neighbors, funneling all of its seaborne trade strictly through the port of Mongla down in Bangladesh. They essentially have to lease their sea access through political goodwill.
And then we get to the most extreme examples, Uzbekistan and Liechtenstein. As we mentioned earlier, these are the only two double landlocked nations on Earth. In Uzbekistan's case, every single one of its neighbors, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan, is also landlocked. You have to cross at least two foreign borders, deal with two entirely different sets of customs officials, and rely on two entirely different foreign infrastructures just to reach a beach.
Part 4. Wealth without the sea. Okay, so this next part is absolutely vital to the story. Lacking a coastline is not an automatic economic death sentence. Geography is a serious challenge, sure, but it is not an absolute destiny. We really have to contrast the 32 highly vulnerable landlocked developing countries, which genuinely struggle with isolation and high poverty rates, with wealthy European landlocked nations like Switzerland, Austria, or Luxembourg. Those European nations prove beyond a doubt that geography isn't everything. So what exactly is their secret? Well, the secret to wealth without the sea is twofold. First, these European countries are surrounded by highly developed cooperative transit neighbors, which creates incredibly short, frictionless distances to global seaports. Second, and this is key, they export high-value goods, things like technology, finance, and specialized manufacturing. Think about it. If you're exporting a high-value Swiss watch, the transport cost is a minuscule fraction of its overall value. But if you're a developing country exporting bulk, primary agricultural commodities like cotton or grain, those transit costs are going to consume a massive percentage of your profits. Part 5. Becoming land-linked. So the big question is, how do we solve this geographic disadvantage for the 600 million people living in developing landlocked nations today? How do we help them build that frictionless environment? The United Nations Development Program suggests a pretty massive shift in vocabulary and strategy. The goal now is transforming these nations from trapped, landlocked areas into hyper-connected, land-linked hubs. This takes a three-step approach: building resilient transport corridors like modern rail and road networks, digitizing trade to completely bypass physical geography through e-commerce, and deeply integrating regional markets so neighboring countries actually trade with each other rather than just using each other as highways to the ocean. The global blueprint for making this happen over the next decade is called the Awaza Program of Action, running from 2024 to 2034. It focuses heavily on seamless trade facilitation and boosting digital connections. But crucially, it goes way beyond traditional infrastructure to focus on building resilience against climate change. For a landlocked country, an extreme climate shock, like a flash flood that washes away a crucial transit road in a neighboring country, can instantly sever their one and only lifeline to the global economy. So climate resilience isn't just a luxury here, it is an absolute necessity for survival. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. In a world that is increasingly united by digital trade, global e-commerce, and high-speed infrastructure, does geography really still have to dictate a nation's destiny? As we invest in better transit corridors and tighter global cooperation, will the historical lines drawn on a map ever stop limiting a country's potential? It is a fascinating question, and one that 600 million people are waiting to see answered over this next decade. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the map.